The teapot steamed on the lace-covered table, but the chair at the end of the row sat empty, and the knitting needles beside it lay broken. Not bent or dropped carelessly, but snapped clean through their middle. The wooden bodies splintered, as if someone had taken them deliberately between their hands and twisted with terrible force. The sight of them sent an odd chill through the room. Those two innocent implements that had once clicked so rhythmically in Eleanor Whitmore's capable fingers, now lying lifeless on the mahogany surface like the bones of some small, murdered thing. Mrs. Dorothy Pembridge stood in the doorway of St. Mary's Parish Hall, her own knitting bag clutched against her chest, and felt the first stirrings of genuine fear. The Tuesday evening meeting of the St. Mary Mead Knitting Circle had been scheduled for 7 o'clock sharp, as it had been every week for the past 15 years. Dorothy had arrived at precisely 10 minutes past, fashionably late, as was her custom, expecting to find the usual scene of comfortable domesticity. That had become as familiar as her own sitting room. 6 women arranged around the long table, their needles catching the warm lamplight as they worked, the gentle murmur of village gossip mixing with the soft click-click-click of stitches being formed. Instead, she found this: 5 chairs occupied, 1 glaringly empty, and an atmosphere so thick with unspoken tension that it seemed to press against her skin like damp wool. The women who were present sat unnaturally still, their own knitting forgotten in their laps, their eyes fixed on those broken needles with expressions that ranged from bewilderment to something approaching terror. Mrs. Agatha Thornbury, the circle's unofficial leader and the village's most accomplished gossip, was the first to speak. Her voice came out as barely more than a whisper, though whether from reverence or fear, Dorothy could not tell. She was here, Agatha said, her pale eyes, never leaving the broken implements. Not 10 minutes ago she was sitting right there working on that green cardigan for her granddaughter. I turned to speak to Millicent about the pattern, and when I looked back, she gestured helplessly at the empty chair. The needles were already broken when we noticed she was gone, added Mrs. Sarah Fletcher, a thin woman with nervous hands that fluttered constantly around her throat, just lying there like that, as if someone had snapped them in anger. Dorothy set down her knitting bag with deliberate care and moved closer to the table. The empty chair was positioned slightly away from the others, as if Eleanor had pushed it back before rising. The green wool of her unfinished cardigan lay neatly folded beside the broken needles. The stitches still live on the circular needle she had been using for the body. But it was the positioning of those snapped straight needles that troubled Dorothy most. They lay parallel to each other, placed with an almost ceremonial precision that spoke of intention rather than accident. "Did anyone see her leave?" Dorothy asked, though she already suspected the answer. The 5 women exchanged glances that were heavy with shared guilt. It was Mrs. Violet Cunningham, a gentle soul who bred prize roses and rarely spoke above a murmur, who finally responded. "We were all so absorbed in our work," she said, her voice carrying the weight of self-recrimination. "You know how it is when the pattern becomes complex. The mind simply focuses inward. One moment she was there, working away with that little smile she always wore when she was concentrating, and the next, she spread her hands in a gesture of helpless confusion. Mrs. Millicent Webb, whose sharp eyes and sharper tongue had made her the unofficial chronicler of every scandalous whisper in St. Mary Mead, leaned forward in her chair. "There's something else," she said, and her tone carried that particular quality that preceded the most delicious gossip. "Something none of you noticed, because you were all too busy pretending not to see." The other women turned toward her with the synchronized movement of flowers following the sun, and Dorothy felt her pulse quicken. Millicent Webb never spoke of mysteries lightly. Her reputation for ferreting out secrets was legendary in the village. "The pattern she was working on," Millicent continued, reaching across the table to touch the folded green wool with one finger. It wasn't the cardigan pattern we'd all seen before. This is something entirely different. Something I've never seen Eleanor attempt before. Dorothy moved closer, her eyes studying the neat rows of stitches that marched across the knitted fabric. At first glance, it appeared to be a simple moss stitch, the kind of basic pattern that any competent knitter could execute without conscious thought. But as she looked more carefully, she began to see what Millicent had noticed: subtle variations in the stitch placement, tiny deviations that created an almost imperceptible pattern within the pattern. "It looks like writing," whispered Mrs. Fletcher, and Dorothy felt a chill run down her spine as she realized the woman was right. The variations in the stitches, when viewed from the correct angle, formed shapes that resembled letters. Crude, blocky letters that spelled out words Dorothy could not quite decipher in the lamplight. Mrs. Thornbury rose from her chair with the ceremonious dignity she reserved for moments of high drama. "I think," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had appointed herself the village's unofficial crisis manager, "that we should call the police. This is most irregular, and poor Eleanor might have met with some sort of misfortune." But Dorothy found herself shaking her head, even as the other women murmured their agreement. Something about the scene felt wrong, in a way that had nothing to do with criminal activity. The broken needles, the mysterious knitting pattern, the complete absence of any sign of struggle. It all spoke of intention rather than accident, of careful planning rather than sudden violence. Eleanor Whitmore had been a fixture of the village. For over 40 years, a woman whose quiet competence and gentle manner had made her beloved by everyone who knew her. She was not the sort of person who simply vanished without reason, nor was she the sort who would abandon her knitting mid-row unless something of extraordinary importance had demanded her attention. "Perhaps," Dorothy said carefully, "we should wait until tomorrow before involving the authorities. Eleanor might simply have received an urgent message, a family emergency perhaps, or news that required her immediate attention. She might have been so distracted that she accidentally broke her needles in her haste to leave." The explanation sounded weak even to her own ears, but the other women seized upon it, with the desperate relief of people who wanted very much to believe that nothing truly terrible had occurred in their peaceful village. They began to chatter among themselves, constructing elaborate scenarios that would explain Eleanor's disappearance in the most innocent possible terms. A sick grandchild, perhaps, or a telephone call with news that simply could not wait. But Dorothy continued to stare at those broken needles, and the longer she looked at them, the more convinced she became that their precise placement was no accident. Someone had snapped them deliberately and arranged them just so. But whether that someone had been Eleanor herself, or another person entirely, she could not begin to guess. The meeting dissolved with unusual haste, the women packing their knitting with nervous efficiency and departing into the October evening with promises to telephone each other if Eleanor should appear or if any news should arrive. Dorothy waited until she was the last person in the hall, then approached the table once more to examine the mysterious knitting pattern by the light of the reading lamp. The green wool was soft beneath her fingers, worked in a fine gauge that spoke of Eleanor's considerable skill, but the pattern itself defied easy interpretation. The subtle variations in stitch placement were clearly deliberate, but they formed no pattern Dorothy recognized from her 40 years of knitting experience. If they were indeed letters, as Mrs. Fletcher had suggested, they were letters formed according to some code that Eleanor had devised herself. Dorothy carefully lifted the knitting and held it closer to the light, studying each row with the intensity of a scholar examining an ancient manuscript. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to make sense of the subtle language Eleanor had woven into her stitches. A knit stitch followed by 2 purls, then 3 knits and a purl. It was a code, she realized with growing excitement. A simple substitution. Cipher, where different stitch combinations represented different letters of the alphabet. Working backwards from the most recent rows, Dorothy began to translate the message Eleanor had knitted into her green wool. The first word that emerged made her gasp aloud in the empty hall: danger. The second word chilled her blood: follows. And the third, which Eleanor had been working on when she disappeared, was incomplete but unmistakable: me. Dorothy set the E, knitting down with trembling hands, and looked around the deserted hall with new eyes. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper now, more threatening. The sound of wind rattling the windows took on an ominous quality that made her skin prickle with apprehension. Eleanor Whitmore had been knitting a message, a warning, right up until the moment she vanished, and if that message was to be believed, she had been in mortal danger. The broken needles suddenly took on a new and terrible significance. They had not been snapped in haste or accident. They had been broken deliberately, perhaps as a signal, perhaps as a threat. Dorothy imagined Eleanor's fingers working frantically to complete her coded message, her eyes darting toward the door of the hall as she sensed some approaching menace. Had she broken the needles herself, as a final gesture of defiance? Or had someone else discovered her secret message and destroyed her tools in anger? Dorothy realized she was holding her breath and forced herself to exhale slowly. The rational part of her mind insisted that she was letting her imagination run away with her, that there must be some perfectly innocent explanation for Eleanor's disappearance and the mysterious knitting. But the evidence of her own eyes was undeniable. Eleanor had been frightened enough to encode a warning into her knitting, frightened enough to risk discovery by working on it during the weekly meeting. As Dorothy finally gathered her courage to leave the parish hall, she found herself glancing over her shoulder with each step, half expecting to see some lurking figure emerge from the shadows. The October night was crisp and clear, with a full moon that cast everything in sharp relief. But instead of feeling comforted by the visibility, she found the silver light somehow menacing. Every rustle of leaves seemed to herald approaching footsteps. Every shifting shadow might conceal a watching eye. The walk to her cottage, which she had made countless times in perfect safety, felt like a journey through hostile territory. When she finally reached her front door and turned the key with hands that shook only slightly, Dorothy realized that Eleanor's fear had become her own. Whatever danger had driven the older woman to weave warnings into her knitting was still out there in the darkness, waiting and watching. And somewhere in the village of St. Mary Mead, a gentle woman who had never harmed a soul in her 73 years had vanished as completely as if she had never existed at all, leaving behind only broken needles and a message of fear stitched in green wool. In her cottage on the far side of the village, Miss Jane Marple set down her own knitting and frowned at the pattern she had been working on, a complex Fair Isle design that had been giving her trouble all evening. The stitches seemed to resist her usual rhythm, and twice she had found herself dropping stitches in places where she never made mistakes. It was as if some disturbance in the natural order of things had infected even the most mundane activities with an aura of unease. Miss Marple was not given to flights of fancy or superstitious fears, but 40 years of observation had taught her that knitting, like most feminine arts, possessed its own subtle language. The tension of the stitches, the choice of colors, the complexity of patterns, all of these things revealed something about the inner state of the woman who created them. A nervous knitter produced tight, uneven fabric. An angry knitter worked with jerky, aggressive movements that left their mark in every row. And a frightened knitter. Miss Marple paused in her work and considered the question. She had never encountered truly frightened knitting before, but she imagined it would be characterized by desperate haste, by mistakes that were corrected and recorrected, by the kind of frenetic energy that came from trying to outrun something. That could not be escaped. She was still pondering this question when her telephone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the evening quiet like a knife. Miss Marple set aside her knitting with the careful precision that characterized all her movements, and rose to answer the call. Miss Marple. The voice on the other end belonged to Mrs. Dorothy Pembridge, whom Miss Marple knew slightly from church, functions and village committees, but there was a quality to Dorothy's voice that she had never heard before, a breathless tension that spoke of recent shock. Yes, my dear. What can I do for you? I'm terribly sorry to bother you so late in the evening, Dorothy continued, her words tumbling over each other in their haste to be spoken. But something rather odd has happened at the knitting circle tonight, and I thought, that is, everyone knows about your talent for, well, for noticing things that others might miss. Miss Marple settled herself more comfortably in her chair, recognizing the preface to what would undoubtedly be a most interesting story. Please go on. I'm all attention. Dorothy's account of the evening's events was thorough and precise, painted in the kind of vivid detail that spoke of a naturally observant mind. As she listened, Miss Marple found herself creating a mental picture of the parish hall, the arrangement of chairs, the precise positioning of those broken needles. But it was Dorothy's description of the knitting itself, the coded message worked into what appeared to be innocent stitchwork, that captured her complete attention. You're quite certain about the translation? Miss Marple asked when Dorothy had finished her account. The message read, "Danger follows me." As certain as I can be, given that I had to work out the cipher myself. Eleanor was using a simple substitution, one knit stitch for A, knit purl for B, and so forth. Rather clever, actually, though time-consuming to execute. Miss Marple nodded, though Dorothy could not see her. She had heard of such things before. Coded messages worked into embroidery during wartime, secret communications hidden in the patterns of quilts. But this was the first time she had encountered a coded knitting pattern in peaceful St. Mary Mead, and the implications were deeply troubling. Has anyone attempted to contact Mrs. Whitmore at her home? Miss Marple asked. I telephoned just before, calling you. There was no answer. Though her lights were on when I walked past on my way home, I thought about knocking, but Dorothy's voice trailed off, and Miss Marple could hear the fear that lurked beneath her careful composure. But you were afraid of what you might find. Yes. I know it sounds foolish, but there was something about those broken needles, the way they were positioned so deliberately, and that message. If Eleanor really was in danger, then whoever threatened her might still be about. Miss Marple considered this carefully. In her experience, fear was rarely foolish, particularly when it was felt by sensible women who were not given to dramatic imaginings. If Dorothy Pembridge was frightened, there was almost certainly good reason for her fear. I think, Miss Marple said at last, that you were quite right to be cautious, and equally right to wait before involving the police. These matters often resolve themselves in ways that official investigation might complicate unnecessarily. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Miss Marple could almost hear Dorothy weighing her words. Would you, that is, if it wouldn't be too much trouble, would you consider looking into the matter yourself? Everyone in the village knows about your extraordinary ability to see patterns that others miss, and I can't shake the feeling that Eleanor's disappearance is part of some larger pattern that I'm simply not clever enough to recognize. Miss Marple smiled at the compliment, though she wondered if her reputation for solving mysteries had grown beyond all reasonable proportion. Still, the case as Dorothy had described it possessed several features that intrigued her considerably. The coded message, the broken needles, the complete absence of any obvious motive for Eleanor's disappearance, it was the sort of puzzle that appealed to her methodical mind. "I should be happy to make some discreet inquiries," Miss Marple said at last. "Perhaps you could meet me at Eleanor's cottage tomorrow morning. I should like to see this mysterious knitting for myself, and it might be helpful to examine her home as well." They arranged to meet at 10 o'clock the following morning, and after Dorothy had rung off, Miss Marple returned to her own knitting with a thoughtful expression. The Fair Isle pattern that had been troubling her all evening suddenly seemed to resolve itself under her needles, the complex colour-work flowing with its accustomed rhythm, but her mind was far from the intricacies of traditional Scottish design. Instead, she found herself thinking about Eleanor Whitmore, whom she knew only by sight and reputation, a quiet woman, recently widowed, who lived alone in the cottage that had been her home for more than 40 years. Eleanor had no enemies that anyone knew of, no family disputes or financial troubles that might provide a motive for harm. She was by all accounts exactly the sort of unremarkable village resident who lived her life in comfortable obscurity and bothered no one, which made her sudden disappearance all the more puzzling. In Miss Marple's experience, people did not simply vanish without reason, particularly not people who took the trouble to knit coded warnings into their handwork. Eleanor Whitmore had been afraid of something specific, afraid enough to risk discovery by working on her secret message during a public gathering. That fear had been justified by subsequent events, but what had Eleanor known or seen or suspected that had made her a target for whatever malevolent force now stalked the peaceful village of St. Mary Mead? Miss Marple worked on her knitting until nearly midnight, her fingers moving with automatic precision while her mind turned over the possibilities. When she finally set aside her needles and prepared for bed, she found herself checking the locks on her doors with unusual care. If Eleanor Whitmore's fears had been justified, then it was possible that whatever had threatened her might threaten others as well. And if that were the case, then a woman who made a hobby of solving mysteries might find herself in considerable danger indeed. The following morning dawned grey and overcast, with the sort of persistent drizzle that seemed to seep into one's very bones. Miss Marple dressed with her usual attention to detail, choosing a sensible wool coat and sturdy walking shoes that would serve her well if the investigation required tramping through damp countryside. She tucked a small notebook into her handbag, along with a magnifying glass that had proved useful in previous mysteries, and set out for Eleanor Whitmore's cottage with a feeling of anticipation that bordered on excitement. Dorothy Pembridge was waiting for her at the garden gate, looking pale and nervous in the grey morning light. She had clearly slept poorly, if at all, and the events of the previous evening had left their mark in the form of dark circles beneath her eyes and a tremor in her hands that she could not quite control. "Any word from Eleanor?" Miss Marple asked. As they walked up the neat gravel path to the front door, Dorothy shook her head. "I've been watching the cottage since dawn, hoping to see some sign of movement, but the house has been dark and silent all morning. I'm beginning to fear that something truly terrible has happened." Eleanor's cottage was a picture of rural English charm, with climbing roses around the door and neat flower borders that spoke of meticulous care. But there was something indefinably wrong about the scene that Miss Marple noticed immediately, a quality of abandonment that went beyond mere temporary absence. The morning newspaper lay uncollected on the doorstep, and the curtains were drawn in a way that seemed more permanent than the casual closure one might expect from someone who had stepped out briefly. Miss Marple knocked firmly on the front door, though she expected no response. When none came, she tried the handle and found it locked. She walked around the cottage, examining the windows and the back door, but found no sign of forced entry or struggle. Everything appeared normal and undisturbed, which somehow made the situation more ominous rather than less. "The parish hall?" Miss Marple suggested, and Dorothy nodded with obvious relief. They made their way back through the village, past cottages where smoke was beginning to rise from morning fires, and windows were brightening with the glow of breakfast preparations. St. Mary Mead was waking to what appeared to be an ordinary Thursday morning, blissfully unaware that one of its long-time residents had vanished without trace. The parish hall was unlocked, as Dorothy had promised, and they found the long table exactly as it had been left the previous evening. Miss Marple examined the scene with the methodical thoroughness that had served her well in previous investigations. The broken needles lay exactly as Dorothy had described them, positioned with a precision that spoke of deliberate arrangement, rather than accidental breakage. But it was the knitting itself that captured her complete attention. Miss Marple had been working with wool and needles for more than 60 years, and she had never seen anything quite like Eleanor's mysterious pattern. The green cardigan appeared normal at first glance, but closer examination revealed the subtle code that Dorothy had detected. Using her magnifying glass, Miss Marple traced each row of stitches, translating the pattern into letters and words, with growing fascination. The message was indeed as Dorothy had reported. Danger follows me. But there was more. Rows that Dorothy had not had time to decipher in the poor light of the previous evening. Working backward from the point where Eleanor had stopped knitting, Miss Marple slowly assembled a longer message that chilled her. To the bone. They know I know about the society, she read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. Must not let them find the records. If something happens to me, look in the... And there the message ended abruptly. The final word, incomplete. Dorothy had gone very pale. Society? What society could she mean? Miss Marple continued to study the knitting, looking for any other clues that might be hidden in the pattern. I'm not certain, she said at last, but Eleanor was clearly involved in something much more complex than any of her friends realized. This message suggests that she had uncovered information about some sort of secret organization, information that made her a target for their attention. But Eleanor was the most innocent person imaginable. Dorothy protested. She spent her time knitting and gardening and visiting the sick. What could she possibly have known about any secret society? It was a question that would haunt Miss Marple for days to come. Eleanor Whitmore had been, by all outward appearances, exactly the sort of unremarkable village widow who lived quietly and bothered no one. But her final message suggested a hidden complexity that no one had suspected, involvement in some clandestine organization that had ultimately cost her her freedom, if not her life. Miss Marple carefully folded the green knitting and tucked it into her handbag. I think, she said slowly, that we must begin by learning everything we can about Eleanor's activities over the past few months. Someone she trusted betrayed her to this society, someone close enough to know about her discoveries. And that someone may well be one of the women who sat around this very table last night, pretending shock at Eleanor's disappearance, while knowing exactly what had become of her. The thought that one of the knitting circle members might be involved in Eleanor's disappearance struck Dorothy like a physical blow. These were women she had known for years, friends with whom she had shared countless cups of tea and innocent gossip. The idea that one of them might be harboring dark secrets seemed impossible to accept. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that the most dangerous people were often those who appeared most innocent, most trustworthy, most above suspicion. If Eleanor Whitmore had indeed stumbled upon evidence of a secret society operating in St. Mary Mead, then that society would have had no choice but to silence her. And what better way to ensure her silence than to have her betrayed by someone she trusted completely? As they prepared to leave the parish hall, Miss Marple found herself studying the arrangement of chairs around the long table with new interest. 6 women had sat here every Tuesday evening for 15 years, sharing patterns and gossip in apparent harmony. But one of those chairs now sat empty. Its occupant vanished without trace. And if Miss Marple was correct in her suspicions, one of the remaining 5 chairs had been occupied by a traitor, someone who had smiled and chatted and shared knitting tips while secretly planning Eleanor's destruction. The investigation that lay ahead would require all of Miss Marple's considerable skills of observation and deduction. But she was confident that patience and persistence would eventually reveal the truth, no matter how deeply it might be buried. Eleanor Whitmore deserved justice, and Miss Marple was determined that she would have it. The first step would be to learn more about Eleanor's recent activities and associations. Someone in the village must have noticed unusual behavior, strange visitors, or suspicious activities that might provide a clue to the identity of the mysterious society. And once Miss Marple had identified the organization and its members, she would be well on her way to solving the mystery of the knitting club and the woman who had vanished in the night, leaving behind only broken needles and a message of fear. Miss Marple's investigation began, as most of her investigations did, with a careful study of human nature in its most everyday manifestations. She had learned over the years that extraordinary crimes were usually committed by perfectly ordinary people who found themselves in circumstances that brought out the worst aspects of their character. The secret, she had discovered, lay not in looking for obvious villains, but in understanding how apparently innocent individuals could be driven to desperate acts. With this philosophy in mind, she set about learning everything she could about the 5 remaining members of the St. Mary Mead knitting circle. Each woman would need to be studied carefully, her recent behavior analyzed for signs of stress or guilt that might indicate involvement in Eleanor's disappearance. It was painstaking work that required infinite patience and a keen eye for the subtle inconsistencies that revealed hidden truths. Mrs. Agatha Thornbury, the circle's unofficial leader, lived in a substantial Victorian house that had been in her family for 3 generations. She was a woman of considerable local influence, serving on numerous committees and charitable organizations. Her reputation was that of a pillar of the community, someone whose word was trusted and whose judgment was respected. But Miss Marple had learned to be suspicious of people with too perfect reputations, particularly when those reputations provided excellent cover for less savory activities. Miss Marple arranged to call on Mrs. Thornbury the following afternoon, ostensibly to discuss the upcoming church bazaar, but actually to observe the woman in her natural environment. The Thornbury house was imposing and well-maintained, with extensive gardens that required the services of 2 full-time gardeners. The interior was decorated with expensive furniture and artwork that spoke of considerable wealth, though Mrs. Thornbury had always claimed to live on a modest widow's pension. "Such a terrible business about poor Eleanor," Mrs. Thornbury said as she poured tea from an elaborate silver service. "I simply cannot understand what could have possessed her to leave so abruptly. It's most unlike her to be inconsiderate." Miss Marple sipped her tea and studied her hostess carefully. Mrs. Thornbury's hands were steady, her voice calm and controlled. But there was something in her eyes, a watchfulness that suggested she was measuring every word before she spoke it. "Had Eleanor seemed troubled recently?" Miss Marple asked. "Worried about anything in particular?" Mrs. Thornbury considered the question with apparent care. "Now that you mention it, she had been rather preoccupied for the past few weeks. Less talkative than usual, more inclined to work on her knitting in silence. I assumed she was simply concentrating on a difficult pattern. The green cardigan she was working on." "Yes, that was it. Quite an unusual design, actually. I don't recall seeing Eleanor attempt anything so complex before. She was usually content with simple patterns, scarves and dishcloths and such basic items." Miss Marple made a mental note of this observation. If Eleanor had indeed been knitting a coded message, it would have required considerable concentration and planning. The complexity of the pattern might well have been remarked upon by her knitting companions, which raised the question of why none of them had thought to examine it more closely when Eleanor disappeared. "Did she mention where she had found the "Pattern?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Thornbury shook her head. She was rather secretive about it, actually. Usually we all share our patterns freely, but Eleanor seemed reluctant to discuss this particular project, almost as if it were some sort of personal secret. The conversation continued for another hour, covering the various activities of the knitting circle and the personalities of its members. Mrs. Thornbury proved to be a font of information about her fellow knitters, though Miss Marple noticed that her observations were coloured by a subtle malice that suggested she found considerable pleasure in others' shortcomings. "Mrs. Fletcher has been under considerable financial strain recently," Mrs. Thornbury confided, with the satisfaction of someone sharing particularly juicy gossip. "Her husband's business venture failed quite spectacularly, and I understand they're having difficulty meeting their mortgage payments. Not that she said anything directly, of course, but one notices these things." Miss Marple filed this information away for future reference. Financial desperation was one of the oldest motives for criminal behavior, and if Mrs. Fletcher had been in need of money, she might have been vulnerable to offers of payment in exchange for information about Eleanor's activities. "And Mrs. Webb has been acting rather strangely lately," Mrs. Thornbury continued. "More secretive than usual, if such a thing is possible. She's always been one for knowing everyone's business, but recently she's seemed almost furtive in her behavior. I've seen her having conversations that stop abruptly when others approach, most unlike her usual tendency to broadcast every detail of her discoveries." This observation was more troubling than Mrs. Thornbury perhaps realized. Millicent Webb was known throughout the village for her insatiable curiosity about other people's affairs. If she had recently become secretive about her activities, it might indicate involvement in something she preferred to keep hidden. Miss Marple left the Thornbury house with a great deal to consider. Each piece of information she had gathered raised new questions rather than providing answers. Mrs. Fletcher's financial difficulties might have made her susceptible to bribery or coercion. Mrs. Webb's recent secretiveness could indicate guilty knowledge of Eleanor's fate. And Mrs. Thornbury herself, despite her apparently helpful cooperation, had revealed certain inconsistencies in her account that deserved further investigation. The next step would be to speak with each of the remaining knitting circle members, individually, comparing their stories and watching for the small discrepancies that might reveal which of them was not telling the truth. It was delicate work that would require all of Miss Marple's considerable skill at reading human nature. That evening, as Miss Marple sat by her fire working on her own knitting, she found herself thinking about the nature of secrets and the lengths to which people would go to protect them. Eleanor Whitmore had discovered something about a secret society that operated in St. Mary, Mead, something important enough to cost her her freedom. The question that haunted Miss Marple was simple. What could a gentle village widow possibly have uncovered that was dangerous enough to justify such extreme measures? The answer, she suspected, lay hidden in the everyday life of the village itself. Secret societies did not operate in isolation. They required members, meeting places, sources of funding, and purposes that justified their clandestine existence. If such an organization existed in St. Mary Mead, it would have left traces that a careful observer might detect. Miss Marple resolved to spend the following day examining the village with fresh eyes, looking for signs of unusual activity or unexplained wealth that might indicate the presence of criminal enterprise. Eleanor Whitmore had paid a terrible price for her curiosity, but her sacrifice would not be in vain if it led to the exposure of whatever dark conspiracy had been operating beneath the peaceful surface of village life. The rain had stopped by, morning leaving the village washed clean and sparkling in the autumn sunshine. Miss Marple set out early, on what she described to her housekeeper as a constitutional walk, but which was actually a systematic survey of St. Mary Mead and its inhabitants. She had lived in the village for most of her adult life, but now she looked at familiar sights with the eyes of a detective, searching for anomalies that might have escaped her notice before. The high street presented its usual appearance of rural, English charm, with shops and cottages that had changed little over the past century. But Miss Marple noticed things she had previously overlooked. The expensive new car parked outside the modest cottage where Mrs. Fletcher lived with her supposedly impoverished husband, the unusually heavy curtains that had recently been installed in the windows of several houses, the fact that certain residents who claimed to live on modest incomes seemed to have access to luxuries that exceeded their apparent means. Most intriguing of all was the discovery that several of the village's most respectable residents had been making regular visits to London over the past few months, trips that had not been mentioned in the ordinary course of village gossip. Miss Marple had always prided herself on staying informed about the activities of her neighbours, but it appeared that certain activities had been deliberately concealed from casual observation. She made her way to the village post office where Mrs. Hartwell, the postmistress, had served as an unofficial clearinghouse for village information for over 30 years. If anyone would know about unusual mail deliveries or suspicious activities, it would be Mrs. Hartwell. "Miss Marple," the postmistress greeted her with obvious pleasure. "How lovely to see you this morning. What can I do for you today?" "Actually, I was hoping you might help me with a small mystery," Miss Marple said, leaning confidentially across the counter. "I've been trying to organize a surprise party for Eleanor Whitmore's birthday, but I seem to have misplaced her address. You don't happen to remember if she's been receiving any unusual mail recently, do you? I wouldn't want my invitation to go astray." Mrs. Hartwell's expression grew troubled. "Oh, my dear, haven't you heard? Eleanor Whitmore disappeared 2 nights ago, simply vanished from the knitting circle meeting without a word of explanation. The whole village is talking about it." Miss Marple arranged her features in an expression of shocked surprise. "How terrible! Whatever could have happened to her?" "No one knows, though there are all sorts of theories flying about. Some say she might have had a sudden illness that affected her memory. Others think she might have received bad news about a family member. But between you and me," Mrs. Hartwell lowered her voice conspiratorially, "I think there might be more to it than meets the eye." "What makes you say that?" Mrs. Hartwell glanced around the empty post office, then leaned closer across the counter. "Eleanor has been receiving some very unusual mail over the past month. Packages that arrived with no return address, letters postmarked from London that she seemed quite anxious about. And just last week she asked me specifically not to mention her mail to anyone else, said it was a private matter that she preferred to keep to herself." Miss Marple felt her pulse quicken. "How odd. Eleanor never struck me as the sort of person who would have secrets." "That's just what I thought. But people can surprise you, can't they? And there was something about the way she asked for discretion, almost as if she were frightened of something. I've been wondering if I should mention. Hey it to the police, but what would I tell them? That a woman received private mail. It's hardly criminal, is it?" Miss Marple assured Mrs. Hartwell that her discretion was admirable, then made her way back into the high street with considerably more information than she had possessed an hour earlier. Eleanor's mysterious mail correspondence suggested that her involvement with the secret society had been more extensive than anyone had realized. She had clearly been in communication with someone in London, someone whose identity she had been anxious to protect. The next logical step would be to examine Eleanor's cottage more thoroughly. If she had been conducting secret correspondence, there might be letters or documents hidden somewhere in her home that would reveal the nature of her involvement with the mysterious organization. But gaining access to the cottage would require considerable care. If Eleanor's disappearance was indeed the work of the secret society, they might well be watching her home for anyone who showed too much interest in her affairs. Miss Marple decided to approach Mrs. Violet Cunningham, Eleanor's next-door neighbour, who might have observed unusual activities around the cottage. Mrs. Cunningham was known for her prize-winning roses and her gentle, unassuming nature, qualities that often made people more willing to confide in her than they might be with more obviously inquisitive neighbours. The Cunningham cottage was separated from Eleanor's by a low stone wall that would have allowed easy observation of comings and goings. Mrs. Cunningham was working in her garden when Miss Marple arrived, tending to her roses with the kind of loving attention that had made her garden the envy of the village. "Miss Marple," she said, straightening from her work with obvious pleasure, "how lovely to see you. I was just thinking about poor Eleanor and wondering if there's been any news." "I'm afraid not," Miss Marple replied. "In fact, that's rather why I've come to see you. I was hoping you might have noticed anything unusual around Eleanor's cottage recently, any visitors or activities that seemed out of the ordinary." Mrs. Cunningham removed her gardening gloves and considered the question carefully. "Now that you mention it, there have been a few things that struck me as odd. About 3 weeks ago, Eleanor began receiving visits from a gentleman I didn't recognize, well-dressed, driving an expensive motor car, but not someone from the village. He came several times, always in the evening when the light was beginning to fade." "Did you get a good look at him?" "Not really, I'm afraid. Middle-aged, perhaps, with greying hair. But there was something about his manner that made me uneasy. He moved very quietly, almost furtively, as if he didn't want to be observed. And Eleanor seemed nervous whenever he called. I could see her peering through the curtains before she answered the door." This information confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions about Eleanor's involvement with outside parties. The mysterious visitor could well have been a representative of the secret society, either recruiting Eleanor or pressuring her about whatever information she had discovered. "Did the visits continue right up until Eleanor's disappearance?" Mrs. Cunningham shook her head. "The last visit was about a week ago, and that one was different from the others. There was some sort of argument. I couldn't hear the words, but their voices were raised, and the gentleman left rather abruptly. Eleanor seemed quite distressed afterward. I saw her walking in her garden late that night, pacing back and forth, as if she were trying to make some difficult decision." Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Cunningham for her observations and made her way thoughtfully back toward the village centre. The picture that was emerging was increasingly disturbing. Eleanor had clearly been under pressure from someone connected to the mysterious society, pressure that had intensified in the weeks before her disappearance. The argument Mrs. Cunningham had witnessed might well have been the final confrontation that led to Eleanor's decision to encode a warning message in her knitting. But what had Eleanor discovered that was significant enough to warrant such attention? And how had a village widow with no apparent connections to criminal activity become involved with a secret society in the first place? The answer to those questions, Miss Marple suspected, lay in Eleanor's past, in some connection or association that had remained hidden from her neighbours and friends. She resolved to spend the remainder of the day learning everything she could about Eleanor's background, particularly the years before she had settled in St. Mary Mead. The village library proved to be a treasure trove of information about local residents, past and present. Miss Marple spent several hours examining old newspapers, parish records and historical documents that traced the lives and connections of St. Mary Mead's inhabitants. What she discovered about Eleanor Whitmore was both surprising and enlightening. Eleanor had not, as most people assumed, spent her entire life in quiet domesticity. Before her marriage to the late Mr. Whitmore, she had worked for several years in London as a secretary in a government office, specifically in a department that dealt with wartime intelligence and security matters. The position had required a high level of security clearance and had brought her into contact with information that was classified at the highest levels. More intriguingly, several of Eleanor's former colleagues from that London office had settled in various small villages throughout England after the war. establishing themselves as respectable members of rural communities while maintaining connections that were invisible to casual observation. If Miss Marple's suspicions were correct, these former intelligence operatives had formed some sort of network that continued to operate decades after the war's end. The implications were staggering. What had appeared to be a simple case of village intrigue was beginning to reveal connections to matters of national security and international espionage. Eleanor Whitmore had not been an innocent victim of local crime. She had been a former intelligence operative who had discovered something about the activities of her old colleagues, something dangerous enough to cost her her freedom. Miss Marple closed the historical records with hands that trembled slightly from excitement and apprehension. She had uncovered the edges of a conspiracy that reached far beyond the boundaries of St. Mary Mead, a network of former spies who had used their wartime connections to establish some sort of ongoing criminal enterprise. Eleanor had been eliminated, not because of anything she had done, but because of what she had discovered about what her former colleagues were doing. The question now was how to proceed. If Miss Marple's suspicions were correct, she was dealing with people who possessed both the skills and the ruthlessness necessary to eliminate threats to their security. Eleanor's disappearance had been accomplished with professional efficiency, leaving no trace of violence or obvious criminal activity. These were not amateur criminals motivated by greed or passion. They were trained operatives who would not hesitate to eliminate anyone who posed a threat to their operations. But Miss Marple had one significant advantage: her reputation as a harmless village spinster, whose interest in local mysteries was viewed as an amusing hobby rather than a serious threat. If she proceeded carefully, she might be able to gather enough evidence to expose the conspiracy without alerting its members to the danger she represented. The first step would be to identify which members of the knitting circle were connected to the intelligence network. Eleanor's coded message had suggested that someone close to her had betrayed her to the society, someone who had been trusted with knowledge of her discoveries. That person was almost certainly one of the women who had sat around the table on Tuesday evening, expressing shock and concern while secretly knowing exactly what had happened to their missing friend. Miss Marple spent a sleepless night considering the possibilities. Each member of the knitting circle would need to be investigated thoroughly, their backgrounds examined for connections to wartime intelligence work or suspicious activities that might indicate ongoing criminal involvement. It would be painstaking work that would require all of her skills of observation and deduction. But as she lay in bed listening to the sound of wind in the trees outside her cottage, Miss Marple felt a familiar sense of anticipation that accompanied the beginning of a truly challenging case. Eleanor Whitmore had been silenced, but her final message had provided the key to unraveling the conspiracy that had destroyed her. Justice might be delayed, but it would not be denied. The following morning brought fresh revelations that confirmed Miss Marple's growing suspicions about the scope of the conspiracy she was investigating. A chance encounter with the village doctor, who had been called away on an emergency during the night, provided the first solid evidence that Eleanor's disappearance was connected to a much larger pattern of suspicious activity. Dr. Haydock, who had served the village for over 20 years, was known for his discretion and professionalism, but he was also a man who took his responsibilities seriously, and when Miss Marple encountered him returning from his emergency call, she could see that he was deeply troubled by whatever he had witnessed. "Terrible business," he muttered, more to himself than to Miss Marple. "Third case like this in the past month, and I'm beginning to wonder if there isn't some pattern I'm missing." Miss Marple's interest was immediately aroused. "Pattern, Doctor?" Dr. Haydock seemed to realize for the first time that he had spoken aloud. He glanced around nervously, then stepped closer to Miss Marple and lowered his voice. "Perhaps you'd walk with me for a moment. There's something I'd like to discuss with someone whose judgment I trust." They made their way slowly along the quiet village street, while Dr. Haydock gathered his thoughts. Finally, he began to speak in the careful, measured tones of someone who was choosing his words with extreme care. "I've been called out 3 times in the past month to attend to cases of what appeared to be sudden illness or accident among elderly residents of outlying villages. In each case, the patient was a woman living alone who had been found unconscious or disoriented by neighbors who became concerned when she failed to appear for some regular appointment." Miss Marple felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Were you able to determine the cause of their conditions?" "That's just it. In each case, the symptoms were consistent with some form of drug-induced stupor, but by the time I examined the patients, any traces of the substance had cleared their systems, and in each case, the woman claimed to have no memory of how she had come to be in such a state." "Where are these women now?" Dr. Haydock's expression grew even more troubled. "That's the most disturbing part of all. Within days of their mysterious illnesses, each woman departed her village without notice, leaving behind notes claiming family emergencies or sudden decisions to relocate. But when I attempted to follow up on their welfare, I discovered that the addresses they had left were false, and no one in their supposed destination had any knowledge of their arrival." Miss Marple stopped walking and turned to face the doctor directly. "Are you suggesting that these women were abducted?" "I'm suggesting that 3 elderly women who lived quiet, unremarkable lives suddenly vanished after experiencing unexplained periods of unconsciousness, leaving behind carefully prepared cover stories that would discourage investigation into their disappearances. Draw your own conclusions." The pattern was becoming clear to Miss Marple with horrifying certainty. Eleanor Whitmore was not the first victim of the mysterious society. She was simply the first to realize the danger in time to leave a warning. The organization had been systematically eliminating elderly women who posed some sort of threat to their operations, using methods that left no obvious evidence of criminal activity. But what connected these seemingly random victims? What had they discovered or witnessed that made them targets for elimination? And how many other women had disappeared without anyone recognizing the pattern of their abductions? "Doctor," Miss Marple said quietly, "I think it would be wise if we were to discuss this matter further, but not here on the public street. Would you be willing to call on me this evening? There are some things I've discovered about Eleanor Whitmore's disappearance that might shed light on these other cases." Dr. Haydock agreed readily, and they parted with the understanding that discretion was essential until they could determine the full scope of the conspiracy they were investigating. Miss Marple spent the remainder of the morning in a state of considerable agitation, pacing through her cottage as she tried to organize the fragments of information she had gathered into a coherent theory. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together in a pattern that was both logical and terrifying. Dow's network of former intelligence operatives had established themselves in rural communities throughout England, maintaining their wartime connections while engaging in some form of criminal enterprise. When elderly residents of these communities discovered evidence of their activities, they were systematically eliminated through methods that left no obvious trace of foul play. Eleanor Whitmore's background in wartime intelligence work had made her uniquely qualified to recognize the significance of whatever she had observed. Her former colleagues had probably assumed that her knowledge of their methods would make her more susceptible to intimidation, but they had underestimated her courage and resourcefulness. Her decision to encode a warning message in her knitting had been an act of extraordinary bravery that might ultimately lead to the exposure of the entire conspiracy. But Eleanor's courage had cost her everything, and Miss Marple was determined that her sacrifice would not be in vain. The pattern of disappearances that Dr. Haydock had described suggested that the conspiracy was still active, still eliminating threats to its security with ruthless efficiency. If the network was to be stopped, someone would have to take considerable risks to gather the evidence necessary to expose their activities. Miss Marple had never shrunk from danger when justice was at stake, and she did not intend to begin now. Eleanor Whitmore deserved better than to vanish without trace, her fate unknown and her killers unpunished. The elderly women who had disappeared from other villages deserved to have their stories told and their murderers brought to account. And the people of St. Mary Mead deserved to know that their peaceful village had been infiltrated by criminals who would kill to protect their secrets. That evening, as Miss Marple prepared for her meeting with Dr. Haydock, she reflected on the strange turns that her investigation had taken. What had begun as a simple case of village intrigue had revealed connections to matters of national security and international conspiracy. The stakes were higher than anything she had encountered before, and the dangers were correspondingly greater. But Miss Marple had learned over the years that the most complex crimes were often solved through the careful observation of human nature in its everyday manifestations. Criminals, no matter how sophisticated their methods or extensive their training, were still human beings, subject to the same weaknesses and vulnerabilities that affected everyone. Pride, greed, fear, and anger could all be exploited by a clever investigator who understood how to read the subtle signs that revealed a guilty conscience. The members of the knitting circle who had sat around the table on Tuesday evening had all displayed reactions to Eleanor's disappearance that would bear careful analysis. One of them was almost certainly connected to the conspiracy, and that connection would eventually reveal itself through the kind of small inconsistencies that Miss Marple had learned to detect. When Dr. Haydock arrived that evening, Miss Marple was ready with a comprehensive account of her discoveries about Eleanor's background and the mysterious society that had targeted her. The doctor listened with growing amazement as she laid out the evidence she had gathered, connecting Eleanor's wartime intelligence work to the pattern of disappearances he had observed in other villages. "It's incredible," he said when she had finished her account. "But it explains so many things that puzzled me about those cases. The professional efficiency of the abductions, the carefully prepared cover stories, the complete absence of any trail that might lead to the victim's actual whereabouts. The question now," Miss Marple said, "is how to identify the local members of this network and gather enough evidence to expose their activities without alerting them to the danger they face from our investigation." Dr. Haydock considered this problem carefully. As the village doctor, he was privy to information about the health and personal circumstances of most residents that might not be available to casual observation. If any of the knitting circle members were connected to suspicious activities, he might have noticed signs that others had missed. "I can tell you one thing," he said at last. "Mrs. Thornbury has been receiving medical treatments that are rather more expensive than her supposed income would support. She's been traveling to London regularly for consultations with specialists whose fees are quite substantial. When I questioned her about how she was managing the expense, she claimed to have received a small inheritance from a distant relative." Miss Marple made a mental note of this information. Unexplained wealth was often the first sign of criminal involvement, particularly when it appeared suddenly and was accompanied by improbable explanations. "And Mrs. Webb has been asking some very pointed questions about the medical records of various elderly residents," Dr. Haydock continued. "She claimed to be concerned about their welfare, but her inquiries seemed to focus specifically on women who lived alone and had no close family connections. This revelation was even more disturbing than the first. If Mrs. Webb had been gathering information about vulnerable elderly women, she might have been identifying potential targets for the conspiracy's elimination efforts. The thought that someone Miss Marple had known for years might be involved in such activities was almost impossible to accept, but the evidence was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. "There's one more thing," Dr. Haydock said. his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I received a telephone call this afternoon from a colleague who practices in the next county. He's observed a similar pattern of mysterious disappearances among elderly women in his area, and he's begun to suspect that something systematic is happening. We're not dealing with isolated incidents. This appears to be a coordinated campaign that's been operating across multiple communities." The scope of the conspiracy was larger than Miss Marple had imagined. If similar patterns were appearing in other counties, the network of former intelligence operatives might include dozens or even hundreds of individuals operating with the kind of coordination and resources that suggested ongoing support from external sources. Miss Marple and Dr. Haydock spent the next several hours planning their investigation strategy. They would need to gather evidence systematically while avoiding any actions that might alert the conspiracy to their suspicions. It would be dangerous work that would require both courage and considerable subtlety. But as the evening progressed, Miss Marple felt the familiar excitement that accompanied the beginning of a challenging case. Eleanor Whitmore's coded message had provided the key to unraveling a conspiracy of unprecedented scope and sophistication. The investigation ahead would test all of her skills, but she was confident that patience and persistence would ultimately reveal the truth. The next phase of Miss Marple's investigation required her to examine more closely the activities and associations of each member of the knitting circle. If one of them was indeed connected to the mysterious society, that connection would eventually reveal itself through careful observation of their behavior and circumstances. She began with Mrs. Sarah Fletcher, whose financial difficulties had been mentioned by Mrs. Thornbury as a source of recent stress. The Fletcher cottage was modest but well maintained, located on a quiet lane that provided excellent opportunities for discreet observation. Miss Marple positioned herself in the village tea shop, which offered a clear view of the cottage through its front windows, and settled in to watch for unusual activity. What she observed over the course of several hours was both interesting and troubling. Mrs. Fletcher received 3 separate visits during the morning, each from individuals who did not appear to be local residents. The visitors arrived by motor car, stayed for brief periods, and departed without acknowledging any of the neighbors who passed by during their visits. Most tellingly, Mrs. Fletcher appeared nervous and watchful during these encounters, frequently glancing up and down the street as if concerned about being observed. The pattern of brief, secretive visits suggested that Mrs. Fletcher was involved in activities she preferred to keep hidden from her neighbors. Given her supposed financial difficulties, it was possible that she had been recruited by the conspiracy as a source of information about local residents, paid to identify potential targets for the organization's elimination efforts. Miss Marple's next target for observation was Mrs. Millicent Webb, whose recent secretiveness had been noted by Mrs. Thornbury, and whose inquiries about medical records had troubled Dr. Haydock. Mrs. Webb lived in a cottage that had undergone extensive renovations over the past year, improvements that seemed inconsistent with the modest income of a village widow. The Webb cottage was more difficult to observe discreetly, but Miss Marple managed to position herself in the churchyard, where she could watch the comings and goings while appearing to tend to the flowers on various graves. What she witnessed confirmed her growing suspicions about Mrs. Webb's involvement in the conspiracy. Throughout the afternoon, Mrs. Webb made several telephone calls that appeared to agitate her considerably. Miss Marple could see her through the cottage windows, pacing back and forth while speaking in animated tones to unseen parties. Between calls, Mrs. Webb consulted what appeared to be a notebook or ledger, making notations with the kind of systematic attention that suggested record-keeping rather than casual correspondence. Most significantly, Mrs. Webb received a visit from the same well-dressed gentleman whom Mrs. Cunningham had described seeing at Eleanor's cottage. The man arrived in an expensive motor car, and remained for nearly an hour, during which time Mrs. Webb drew all her curtains and took obvious precautions to avoid being observed. When the visitor departed, Mrs. Webb appeared at her front window and watched his car until it disappeared from view, her expression troubled and fearful. The evidence was accumulating rapidly, but Miss Marple knew that circumstantial observations would not be sufficient to expose the conspiracy or rescue its victims. She needed concrete proof of criminal activity, documentation that would convince the authorities to take action against the network of former operatives. That proof, she realized, might be hidden in Eleanor Whitmore's cottage. If Eleanor had, indeed, discovered evidence of the conspiracy's activities, she might have hidden documentation that would reveal the full scope of their operations. The message she had knitted into her green cardigan had been incomplete, ending with the words, "Look in the..." before her disappearance had prevented her from finishing the instruction. Miss Marple resolved to search Eleanor's cottage that very evening, despite the considerable risks involved. If the conspiracy was still monitoring the property, her investigation might well result in her own disappearance. But Eleanor Whitmore had risked everything to leave a warning about the danger that threatened other elderly women, and Miss Marple could do no less to honor that sacrifice. She spent the remainder of the afternoon making careful preparations for her covert search. She would need to enter the cottage without being observed, locate whatever evidence Eleanor had hidden, and escape without alerting the conspiracy to her discovery. It was the sort of challenge that would have daunted a younger person, but Miss Marple had learned over the years that determination and careful planning could overcome most obstacles. As evening approached and the village settled into its quiet routine, Miss Marple made her way through the gathering darkness toward Eleanor's cottage. The windows were dark, and the property appeared deserted, but she approached with extreme caution, aware that appearances could be deceiving when dealing with professional operatives. The cottage's back door yielded to her careful ministrations, with the lockpicks she had acquired during a previous investigation, and she slipped inside with the stealth of someone who had considerable experience in such activities. The interior was exactly as Eleanor had left it, neat, orderly, and bearing no signs of hasty departure or struggle. Miss Marple began her search systematically, starting with the most obvious hiding places and working her way toward locations that would require greater ingenuity to discover. Eleanor's desk yielded nothing more incriminating than household bills and social correspondence, but Miss Marple had not expected to find important documents in such an obvious location. It was in Eleanor's sewing room that Miss Marple made her first significant discovery. Hidden behind a collection of knitting patterns, she found a manila folder containing photocopied documents that made her blood run cold. The papers were intelligence reports dating from the war years, but they had been annotated with recent, handwritten notes that connected them to contemporary activities. The documents revealed the existence of a network called the Stitch Society, composed of former intelligence operatives who had maintained their wartime connections while establishing themselves in rural communities throughout England. The Society's ostensible purpose was to provide mutual support and companionship for aging former agents, but the reality was far more sinister. According to Eleanor's notes, the Stitch Society had been systematically identifying and eliminating elderly women who posed potential threats to the security of its members. The victims were chosen based on their access to information about local activities, their tendency to ask inconvenient questions, or their possession of knowledge that might compromise ongoing operations. The elimination process was carried out with professional efficiency. Targets were drugged and abducted during carefully planned operations that left no obvious evidence of criminal activity. The victims were then transported to secure locations where they were either killed outright or held prisoner under conditions that ensured their permanent silence. Miss Marple photographed the documents using a small camera she had brought for the purpose. her hands trembling with a mixture of excitement and horror at the scope of the conspiracy she was uncovering. Eleanor had discovered evidence of systematic murder on a scale that defied imagination, and her courage in documenting the society's activities had cost her everything. But Eleanor's final message remained incomplete. She had directed anyone who found her evidence to look in the somewhere. But Miss Marple had not yet discovered the location Eleanor had intended to specify. Somewhere in the cottage, there might be additional evidence that would provide the final pieces of the puzzle. Miss Marple continued her search with renewed urgency, aware that she had already spent too much time in the cottage, and that discovery became more likely with each passing moment. It was in Eleanor's bedroom, hidden inside a hollowed-out book that had been carefully concealed among her reading materials, that she found the evidence that Eleanor had died to protect. The book contained a complete membership list of the Stitch Society, with names, addresses, and detailed profiles of operatives throughout England. Miss Marple recognized several names from St. Mary Mead and surrounding villages, including both Mrs. Thornbury and Mrs. Webb. The list also included contact information for the Society's leadership structure and financial records that revealed the source of funding for their operations. Most shocking of all were the detailed plans for future eliminations, including a target list of elderly women who had been identified as potential threats to the Society's security. Miss Marple's own name appeared on the list, along with notations suggesting that her reputation for solving mysteries had brought her to the attention of the organization's leadership. Miss Marple photographed every page of the hidden documents, working as quickly as possible, while maintaining the precision necessary to ensure clear images. The evidence she was gathering would be more than sufficient to expose the entire conspiracy and bring its members to justice, but only if she managed to escape the cottage without being detected. As she prepared to leave, Miss Marple heard the sound of motor cars approaching along the quiet village street. Through the cottage windows, she could see headlights turning into Eleanor's lane, moving with the purposeful precision that suggested this was not a casual visit. The Stitch Society had apparently discovered her investigation and was moving to eliminate the threat she represented. Miss Marple quickly concealed the evidence she had gathered and looked for an escape route that would allow her to avoid the approaching vehicles. The cottage's back garden offered a path through neighboring properties that might allow her to reach safety without being observed, but she would need to move quickly and quietly to avoid detection. As she slipped out through the back door, Miss Marple could hear car doors slamming and voices speaking in the kind of hushed, urgent tones that suggested professional operatives coordinating a search operation. She had escaped the cottage just in time, but her investigation had clearly been discovered, and the Society would now be aware that their conspiracy had been exposed. The final phase of Miss Marple's investigation would require all of her courage and ingenuity. The Stitch Society knew that their secrets had been discovered, and they would stop at nothing to eliminate the threat to their security. Miss Marple was no longer investigating a historical conspiracy. She was now engaged in a deadly game of cat and mouse with professional killers who possessed both the skills and the ruthlessness necessary to ensure her permanent silence. But Eleanor Whitmore's sacrifice had not been in vain. The evidence Miss Marple had gathered would be sufficient to expose the entire network and bring its members to justice. The challenge now was to survive long enough to deliver that evidence to the proper authorities and ensure that the dozens of elderly women who had vanished without trace would finally receive the justice they deserved. Miss Marple made her way through the darkness toward her own cottage, moving with the caution of someone who knew that every shadow might conceal a watching enemy. The peaceful village of St. Mary Mead had been transformed into a battleground where the stakes were nothing less than life and death, and the outcome would depend on her ability to outmaneuver opponents who possessed every advantage except one: They had underestimated the determination of a village spinster who refused to let evil triumph over innocence. The confrontation that Miss Marple had been expecting came sooner than she had anticipated. She had barely reached the safety of her own cottage when she became aware that she was being watched. Through her sitting-room windows, she could see figures moving in the shadows of her garden, positioning themselves with the strategic precision of professionals conducting a surveillance operation. Miss Marple had faced dangerous situations before, but never anything quite like this. The Stitch Society possessed resources and expertise that far exceeded anything she had encountered in previous investigations. These were not desperate amateurs driven by passion or greed. They were trained operatives who had spent decades perfecting the art of eliminating threats to their security. But Miss Marple had advantages of her own that her opponents might not fully appreciate. She had spent a lifetime studying human nature in all its manifestations, learning to read the subtle signs that revealed guilt, fear, and desperation. More importantly, she had the evidence necessary to expose the entire conspiracy, evidence that was now safely hidden where the society could not retrieve it even if they succeeded in eliminating her. The telephone rang, cutting through the silence of the cottage with startling suddenness. Miss Marple answered with the calm composure that had served her well in previous crises. Miss Marple. The voice was cultured and pleasant, with the kind of assured authority that suggested considerable experience in handling delicate situations. "My name is Colonel Morrison, and I represent certain parties who have become concerned about your recent activities. I wonder if we might have a brief conversation." "I'm afraid I don't know what you mean," Miss Marple replied, though she suspected that deception would prove futile against opponents of this caliber. "Please, Miss Marple, let's not waste time with unnecessary pretense. We know that you've been investigating the disappearance of Eleanor Whitmore, and we're aware that your inquiries have led you to discover certain information that might be misinterpreted by individuals who lack the proper context to understand its significance." The threat was delivered with polite courtesy, but Miss Marple had no illusions about the consequences of refusing to cooperate. The society had eliminated Eleanor Whitmore and dozens of other elderly women with ruthless efficiency. They would not hesitate to add one more name to their list of victims. "What is it that you want from me?" she asked. "Simply this. We would like you to join us for a brief discussion of the situation, during which we can clarify any misunderstandings that might have arisen from your investigation. I'm sure that once you understand the true nature of our organization, you'll agree that discretion is in everyone's best interest." Miss Marple understood perfectly well what was being offered, the same choice that had undoubtedly been presented to Eleanor Whitmore and the other victims. Cooperate with the society's demands for silence, or face the consequences of continued resistance. Eleanor had chosen to resist, and her courage had cost her everything. "Very well," Miss Marple said. "Where would you like to meet?" "We'll send a car for you in half an hour. Please don't attempt to contact anyone or leave any messages that might complicate our discussion. I'm sure you understand the importance of discretion in these matters." The line went dead, leaving Miss Marple alone with the knowledge that she had perhaps 30 minutes to arrange for the evidence she had gathered to reach the proper authorities. The photographs she had taken in Eleanor's cottage were hidden, in a location where the society was unlikely to find them, but they would do no good if she was eliminated before she could ensure their delivery to someone who would act on them. Miss Marple moved quickly but methodically, preparing a package that contained copies of the most crucial evidence, along with a detailed account of her investigation. The package was addressed to Inspector Craddock at Scotland Yard, someone she had worked with before and whose discretion she trusted completely. If her confrontation with the society ended badly, at least the truth would eventually be revealed. The sound of a motorcar approaching her cottage announced the arrival of her escort, to what would almost certainly prove to be her final meeting. Miss Marple gathered her courage and prepared to face whatever awaited her, sustained by the knowledge that Eleanor Whitmore's sacrifice would not be forgotten, and that justice would ultimately prevail, regardless of her own fate. The car that came for Miss Marple was a large, expensive sedan, driven by a man who might have been a chauffeur or bodyguard. He spoke only to give directions, but his manner suggested the kind of professional competence that Miss Marple had learned to associate with former military or intelligence personnel. They drove through the countryside for nearly an hour, finally arriving at a substantial country house that stood isolated among extensive grounds. The property had the look of a place that was maintained but not frequently occupied, the kind of location that would be ideal for conducting business that required complete privacy. Colonel Morrison proved to be exactly what Miss Marple had expected, a distinguished gentleman in his 70s whose military bearing and cultured manner concealed a ruthlessness that was evident in his pale, calculating eyes. He received her in a comfortable sitting room that might have belonged to any prosperous country gentleman, but Miss Marple noticed details that suggested the room's true purpose: heavy curtains that would muffle sound, furniture positioned to prevent easy escape, and subtle security measures that indicated the presence of armed guards. "Miss Marple," Colonel Morrison said with every appearance of genuine pleasure, "how good of you to join us. I trust the journey wasn't too uncomfortable." 2 other individuals were present in the room, and Miss Marple recognized both of them, with a shock that she hoped did not show on her face. Mrs. Agatha Thornbury sat in a wing chair near the fireplace, her familiar features transformed by an expression of cold calculation that Miss Marple had never seen before. Mrs. Millicent Webb occupied another chair, her sharp eyes studying Miss Marple with the intensity of a predator evaluating potential. "Pray, I see you recognize some of our colleagues," Colonel Morrison continued smoothly. "Mrs. Thornbury and Mrs. Webb have been most helpful in maintaining our organization's security within your charming village. Their reports on local activities have proven invaluable in identifying potential threats to our operations." Miss Marple felt a chill that went beyond mere fear. The 2 women she had known for years, trusted members of the community whose opinions she had valued and whose friendship she had enjoyed, were revealed as agents of an organization that murdered elderly women with systematic ruthlessness. The betrayal was almost as shocking as the crimes themselves. "I suppose you're wondering about the nature of our organization," Colonel Morrison said, settling himself in a chair that allowed him to observe all the room's exits. "The Stitch Society began during the war, when a group of us realized that our skills and connections might prove valuable long after the conflict ended. We established ourselves in rural communities throughout England, maintaining our network while appearing to live ordinary, unremarkable lives." Miss Marple listened with the careful attention she had learned to bring to the confessions of criminals, storing every detail for future use should she survive the encounter. "And Eleanor Whitmore was part of this network originally?" Mrs. Thornbury spoke for the first time, her voice carrying none of the warmth that Miss Marple remembered from countless village conversations. "Eleanor was recruited during the war, yes, but she never fully embraced the opportunities that our continued association provided. She was always too sentimental, too concerned with conventional morality to appreciate the broader implications of our work." "What sort of work?" Miss Marple asked. Though she suspected she already knew the answer, Colonel Morrison smiled with the satisfaction of someone who enjoyed explaining his own cleverness. "Information, my dear Miss Marple. In the modern world, information is the most valuable commodity of all. Our network has spent decades gathering intelligence about government activities, industrial developments, and financial transactions that prove quite profitable when sold to the appropriate parties. And the elderly women who've been disappearing," Mrs. Webb leaned forward in her chair, her expression animated by a malicious enthusiasm that Miss Marple found deeply disturbing. "Collateral damage, I'm afraid. Village gossips and busybodies who ask too many questions or notice things they shouldn't have noticed. We couldn't allow them to compromise our operations with their idle chatter." The casual dismissal of human life was breathtaking in its callousness. Miss Marple realized that she was dealing with people who had been corrupted by decades of viewing other human beings as mere obstacles to their personal enrichment. The war had taught them to kill without remorse, and the intervening years had not diminished their capacity for ruthless action. "Eleanor discovered your activities and threatened to expose them," Miss Marple said. "Eleanor discovered certain financial records that would have been inconvenient if they had come to light," Colonel Morrison acknowledged. "We attempted to reason with her, to make her understand that discretion would be in everyone's best interest, but she proved remarkably stubborn in her attachment to outdated concepts of law and morality." Miss Marple could picture Eleanor's final weeks, the mysterious visitor Mrs. Cunningham had observed, the heated argument that had preceded Eleanor's disappearance, the desperate attempt to encode a warning into her knitting before she could be silenced. The older woman's courage in the face of overwhelming danger was both inspiring and heartbreaking. "Where is she now?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Thornbury's expression showed a flicker of something that might have been regret. "Eleanor chose to make things difficult for herself. She could have accepted our offer of comfortable retirement in exchange for her silence, but she insisted on viewing our operations through the lens of conventional morality. The outcome was unfortunate but necessary." Miss Marple understood that Eleanor Whitmore was dead, murdered by people she had once trusted and worked alongside. The knowledge settled in her chest like a cold weight, fueling her determination to ensure that Eleanor's killers faced justice for their crimes. "And now you're faced with the same choice that Eleanor refused," Colonel Morrison said, his tone becoming more businesslike. "You've uncovered information about our organization. That could prove extremely inconvenient if it were to reach the wrong ears. We're prepared to offer you the same comfortable retirement that Eleanor rejected, a generous pension that would allow you to live very well indeed in exchange for your discretion about matters that don't really concern you. And if I refuse?" The 3 members of the Stitch Society exchanged glances that communicated more clearly than words. Miss Marple had no illusions about what her refusal would mean. The same fate that had befallen Eleanor and the dozens of other elderly women who had posed threats to the organization's security. But Miss Marple had spent a lifetime standing up to bullies and criminals, and she was not about to start compromising with murderers now, regardless of the consequences. Eleanor Whitmore had chosen death over collaboration with evil, and Miss Marple could do no less to honor that sacrifice. "I'm afraid I must decline your generous offer," she said with perfect composure. "I've never been one to accept payment for remaining silent about criminal activity." Colonel Morrison's expression hardened, and Miss Marple saw the professional killer that lurked beneath his genteel facade. "I had hoped you would be more reasonable, Miss Marple. Your reputation for intelligence suggested that you would appreciate the futility of resistance. Perhaps my intelligence leads me to different conclusions than yours," Miss Marple replied calmly. "I believe that evil must be opposed regardless of the personal cost, while you appear to believe that personal enrichment justifies any amount of human suffering." Mrs. Webb laughed with genuine amusement. "How wonderfully naive. Do you really believe that your death will accomplish anything useful? We've been eliminating threats to our security for decades, without anyone so much as suspecting our existence. Your disappearance will be just another mysterious case that baffles the local authorities." "Perhaps," Miss Marple acknowledged. "But Eleanor managed to leave evidence of your activities where it would eventually be discovered. I've taken similar precautions." The change in the room's atmosphere was immediate and palpable. Colonel Morrison leaned forward in his chair, his eyes sharp with sudden alertness. What sort of precautions? Miss Marple smiled with the satisfaction of someone who has managed to seize the initiative in a dangerous situation. The sort that ensure justice will be done regardless of my personal fate. I've documented everything I discovered about the Stitch Society, including membership lists, financial records, and detailed accounts of your elimination methods. That information is now in the hands of people who will act on it appropriately. Mrs. Thornbury rose from her chair with sudden agitation. She's bluffing. She couldn't have found the records. They were too well hidden. Were they? Miss Marple asked. Eleanor was remarkably thorough in her documentation of your activities. Her hiding places were clever, but not insurmountable to someone who understood her methods. Colonel Morrison studied Miss Marple's face with the intensity of someone trying to read a crucial piece of intelligence. After a long moment, he reached for the telephone that sat on a nearby table. "Stevens, I want you to send a team to search the Marple cottage immediately. Look for any documents or photographs that might relate to our organization. And check with our contacts at Scotland Yard. See if anything unusual has been delivered there in the past few hours." Miss Marple listened to these instructions with growing satisfaction. The fact that Colonel Morrison was taking her claims seriously suggested that her precautions had been effective. Even if the Stitch Society succeeded in eliminating her, the evidence she had gathered would ensure that justice was eventually done. The next few hours passed in tense waiting as the Society's agents searched for evidence of Miss Marple's investigation. She was held under guard in the country house, watched constantly by people who would not hesitate to kill her if their security required it. But she felt strangely calm, sustained by the knowledge that Eleanor's sacrifice was finally being honored, and that the truth about the Stitch Society would soon be revealed. The call that Colonel Morrison had been waiting for came just before dawn. Miss Marple could hear only one side of the conversation, but it was enough to understand that her precautions had been successful. "They found what?" Colonel Morrison's voice carried a note of barely controlled panic. "How much did she manage to photograph?" There was a long pause as he listened to the response. "And you're certain the package was delivered? There's no way to intercept it?" Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile of triumph. Inspector Craddock would have received her package by now, and Scotland Yard would soon be taking action against the Stitch Society and its members. The organization that had operated in secret for decades was about to be exposed to the full light of official investigation. Colonel Morrison ended his telephone conversation and turned to face Miss Marple with an expression that mixed fury and grudging respect. "It appears that you've been more thorough than we anticipated, Miss Marple. My colleagues inform me that Scotland Yard has received a comprehensive dossier on our organization and is already taking steps to investigate our activities." "Eleanor would be pleased," Miss Marple said quietly. "She died to protect the information. That will now bring you to justice." Mrs. Thornbury laughed bitterly. "Justice? Do you really believe that anything will come of your amateur investigation? We have friends in high places, Miss Marple, people who owe us favors and who won't allow a village spinster's fantasies to destroy decades of careful work." But Colonel Morrison was already moving toward the door, his professional instincts telling him that the time for conversation had passed. "The situation has changed," he announced. "We need to begin implementing our emergency protocols immediately." Miss Marple realized that the Stitch Society had contingency plans for exactly this situation, methods of disappearing that would allow its members to escape justice even after their activities had been exposed. Colonel Morrison and his associates would vanish as completely as Eleanor Whitmore had, but they would do so voluntarily and with resources that would allow them to establish new identities in distant countries. But Miss Marple had accomplished what she had set out to do. Eleanor's murder would not go unpunished, and the elderly women who had disappeared over the past months would receive the justice they deserved. The Stitch Society might escape immediate capture, but their network had been exposed and their operations disrupted beyond repair. As Colonel Morrison prepared to leave, he paused at the door and looked back at Miss Marple with an expression that might have been admiration. "You've proven to be a more formidable opponent than we anticipated, Miss Marple." Eleanor chose well when she encoded that message in her knitting. "Eleanor chose courage over safety," Miss Marple replied. "It's a choice that more people should make when confronted with evil." Colonel Morrison nodded with what appeared to be genuine respect. "Perhaps you're right. But courage has its price, as Eleanor discovered. I hope you find that price acceptable." With that, he was gone, leaving Miss Marple alone with the guards who would undoubtedly receive orders to eliminate her as soon as the society's leaders had reached safety. She had perhaps an hour before her usefulness as a source of information ended, and her existence became nothing more than a liability to be removed. But Miss Marple felt no fear as she waited for whatever fate awaited her. She had lived a full life dedicated to the pursuit of truth and justice, and if that pursuit now cost her everything, it was a price she was prepared to pay. Eleanor Whitmore's courage had inspired her own, and together they had struck a blow against evil that would echo far beyond their individual fates. The sound of approaching sirens broke through the morning quiet like a symphony of hope. Through the windows of the country house, Miss Marple could see police vehicles racing up the long drive, their lights flashing in the pale dawn light. Inspector Craddock had acted on her evidence with the speed and efficiency that she had expected, and Scotland Yard's investigation was already bearing fruit. The guards who had been watching her suddenly seemed uncertain and nervous, unsure whether to maintain their positions or attempt to escape before the police arrived. In their moment of hesitation, Miss Marple saw her opportunity and moved quickly toward the door, determined to reach safety before her captors could recover their composure. But even as she made her escape, Miss Marple's thoughts were with Eleanor Whitmore, whose courage and sacrifice had made this moment of justice possible. The gentle village widow who had loved knitting and gardening had proven to be a hero of extraordinary dimensions, someone whose final act of defiance had brought down a criminal organization that had operated with impunity for decades. The investigation that followed would reveal the full scope of the Stitch Society's crimes. Dozens of elderly women murdered or disappeared, millions of pounds in illegal profits, and a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of government and industry. Some members of the organization would be captured and brought to trial, while others would disappear into the shadows from which they had emerged. But the most important victory was one that could not be measured in arrests or convictions. The knowledge that evil had been exposed and resisted, that ordinary people like Eleanor Whitmore and Miss Marple could stand against overwhelming odds and emerge triumphant through courage and determination. As Miss Marple watched the police take control of the country house and begin their methodical search for evidence, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. What had begun as a simple case of village intrigue had revealed a conspiracy of national significance, a network of criminals who had hidden their activities behind masks of respectability and social service. Eleanor Whitmore's final message, knitted into green wool with trembling fingers as danger closed around her, had become the thread that unraveled the entire conspiracy. Her courage in encoding that warning had cost her everything, but it had also ensured that her death would not be in vain. The broken knitting needles that had first alerted Dorothy Pembridge to something amiss now took on a new significance in Miss Marple's mind. They had been deliberately snapped and positioned as a signal, Eleanor's final act of defiance against the forces that sought to silence her. Like the woman who had wielded them, the needles had been broken, but not defeated, their destruction serving as a beacon that had ultimately led to justice. In the days that followed, as the investigation expanded, and more members of the Stitch Society were identified and arrested, Miss Marple found herself thinking often about the nature of courage and the price of standing up to evil. Eleanor Whitmore had faced a choice between safety and justice, and she had chosen justice even knowing that it would cost her life. The village of St. Mary Mead slowly returned to its normal routines, but it would never quite be the same. The knowledge that neighbors and friends could harbor such dark secrets had shaken the community's faith in its own innocence. The Tuesday evening knitting circle would never meet again. Too many of its members were now revealed as criminals, and too much innocent blood had been spilled in its meeting hall. But the memory of Eleanor Whitmore would endure, honored by those who understood the magnitude of her sacrifice. Her name would be remembered not as a victim of criminal violence, but as a hero who had died to protect others from the same fate that had befallen her. Miss Marple resumed her own knitting with renewed appreciation for the simple domestic art that had played such a crucial role in exposing the Stitch Society's crimes. Every stitch now carried the memory of Eleanor's courage. Every pattern reminded her that even the most innocent activities could be transformed into weapons against evil when wielded by determined hands. The green cardigan that Eleanor had been knitting was preserved as evidence, its coded message carefully translated and documented by investigators who marveled at the ingenuity of the woman who had created it. But Miss Marple knew that the real significance of Eleanor's work lay not in its cleverness, but in the courage it represented. The refusal to remain silent in the face of overwhelming evil, the determination to fight back even when defeat seemed certain. As autumn deepened and the village settled into the quiet rhythms of winter, Miss Marple often found herself walking past Eleanor's cottage, which stood empty now with a "for sale" sign in its neat front garden. The roses were dormant, the flower borders bare, but the house itself seemed to retain something of its former occupant's gentle spirit. Sometimes Miss Marple would pause at the garden gate and remember the woman who had lived there, not the victim of criminal violence that Eleanor had become, but the friend and neighbor she had been for so many years. Eleanor Whitmore had possessed the kind of quiet courage that was rarely recognized until it was tested by extraordinary circumstances, and when that test had come, she had not been found wanting. The mystery of the knitting club was solved, its perpetrators brought to justice, its victims remembered and honored. But the deeper mystery, the question of how ordinary people found the strength to stand against overwhelming evil, remained as compelling as ever. Eleanor Whitmore had provided one answer to that question, an answer written in green wool and paid for with her life. In the end, Miss Marple reflected, the most important victories were often the smallest ones, the decision to resist evil rather than accommodate it, the choice to speak truth rather than comfortable lies, the willingness to risk everything for principles that mattered more than personal safety. Eleanor Whitmore had made those choices when they counted most, and her courage had transformed a quiet village tragedy into a triumph of justice over evil. The teapot had long since grown cold on the lace-covered table in St. Mary's Parish Hall, and the broken knitting needles had been carefully preserved as evidence of crimes that had shocked the nation. But Eleanor Whitmore's true legacy lived on in the memory of those who had been inspired by her example, a reminder that heroes could emerge from the most unlikely places when circumstances demanded courage and conscience refused to be silenced. The chair at the end of the row would remain empty, but the woman who had occupied it had achieved a form of immortality that no criminal conspiracy could ever destroy. Eleanor Whitmore had knitted her way into history, and her story would be remembered long after the names of her murderers had been forgotten. But even as the immediate crisis passed and the members of the Stitch Society faced the consequences of their crimes, Miss Marple found herself troubled by questions that the official investigation had left unanswered. The network of former intelligence operatives had been extensive and well organized, but their activities raised deeper concerns about the nature of power and corruption in post-war England. Inspector Craddock arrived in St. Mary Mead 3 days after the arrests at the country house, his usually composed demeanor showing signs of the strain that came from investigating crimes of unprecedented scope and complexity. He found Miss Marple in her garden, tending to the late autumn flowers with the same methodical care she brought to solving mysteries. "Miss Marple," he said, settling himself on the wooden bench that overlooked her rose borders, "I wanted to thank you personally for the extraordinary service you've rendered to the nation. Without your investigation, the Stitch Society might have continued their operations indefinitely." Miss Marple set down her pruning shears and studied the inspector's face with the careful attention she always brought to reading human expressions. "I sense there's something more you wanted to discuss, Inspector. Some aspect of the case that troubles you." Craddock nodded grimly. "The investigation has revealed connections that go far beyond what we initially suspected. The Stitch Society wasn't just a group of rogue operatives pursuing personal enrichment. They were part of a larger network that includes individuals still in positions of significant authority within the government and intelligence services." The implications were staggering. Miss Marple had assumed that the Stitch Society represented an isolated group of criminals who had exploited their wartime connections for personal gain. But if Craddock was correct, the conspiracy reached into the very institutions that were supposed to protect the nation's security. "How extensive are these connections?" Miss Marple asked. "We're still investigating, but the evidence suggests that certain members of the Stitch Society were providing intelligence to foreign powers while simultaneously eliminating witnesses who might have exposed their activities. Eleanor Whitmore wasn't just killed to protect a criminal enterprise, she was murdered to protect state secrets that could have compromised national security." Miss Marple felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. Eleanor's courage in exposing the conspiracy had been even greater than she had realized. The gentle village widow had discovered evidence of treason on a scale that defied imagination. What was Eleanor's connection to these state secrets? Miss Marple asked. Craddock consulted a notebook that he pulled from his coat pocket. According to the documents you discovered in her cottage, Eleanor had been contacted by other former operatives who suspected that their old colleagues were engaged in activities that went beyond simple criminal enterprise. She had been gathering evidence for months, building a case that would have exposed not just the Stitch Society, but the entire network of traitors they were protecting. The picture that emerged was one of extraordinary complexity and danger. Eleanor Whitmore had not stumbled accidentally upon evidence of criminal activity. She had been deliberately investigating suspected treason, risking everything to protect her country from enemies who operated from within its own institutions. The knitting circle meetings provided perfect cover for her investigation, Craddock continued. She could gather intelligence from the Society's local representatives while appearing to engage in nothing more suspicious than domestic craft work. Her coded messages weren't just warnings about personal danger. They were intelligence reports documenting the activities of active enemy agents. Miss Marple thought about Eleanor's final weeks, the nervous energy that her friends had, attributed to concentration on a difficult knitting pattern. In reality, Eleanor had been conducting one of the most dangerous investigations in the history of British intelligence, using her knitting needles as tools in a secret war against treason and betrayal. Mrs. Thornbury and Mrs. Webb weren't just members of a criminal organization, Miss Marple realized. They were enemy agents. Among others, Craddock confirmed, the Stitch Society was a front for what appears to have been a decades-long espionage operation. Former British operatives were recruited by foreign intelligence services and established in rural communities where they could operate without suspicion while maintaining access to sensitive information through their old professional networks. The Betrayal was even more profound than Miss Marple had imagined. The women she had known as neighbors and friends had been foreign agents, using their positions in the community to gather intelligence and eliminate threats to their operations. Eleanor's murder had not been the act of desperate criminals. It had been a professional assassination carried out by enemy operatives. "What happens now?" Miss Marple asked. Craddock's expression grew even more serious. "That's what I wanted to discuss with you. The investigation has revealed that the Stitch Society was just one cell in a much larger network. We've identified similar organizations operating in dozens of rural communities throughout England, each one established by former operatives who have been feeding information to hostile foreign powers for decades. The scope of the conspiracy was overwhelming. Miss Marple tried to imagine the extent of the damage that might have been done by a network of enemy agents operating with such freedom and sophistication. State secrets, military intelligence, industrial information, all of it could have been compromised by people who were trusted implicitly because of their wartime service. The problem, Craddock continued, is that many of these agents have gone to ground since the arrests began. They've activated escape protocols that were obviously prepared years in advance, and they're disappearing faster than we can identify them. We need someone with your particular talents to help us understand how they think, how they operate, how they might try to complete whatever mission they were originally given." Miss Marple understood what the inspector was asking. The official investigation had the resources to pursue known suspects and follow obvious leads, but it lacked the subtle understanding of human nature that was necessary to anticipate the actions of highly trained enemy agents. Her reputation for seeing patterns that others missed had brought her to the attention of the intelligence services, and they were asking for her help in a matter of national security. "What sort of assistance did you have in mind?" she asked. Craddock leaned forward in his chair, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, despite the fact that they were alone in Miss Marple's private garden. "We believe that the network has one final objective, something they've been working toward for decades. The elimination of witnesses like Eleanor was just the preliminary phase. They're planning something much more significant, something that would justify the enormous resources and time they've invested in establishing their operations." Miss Marple felt her pulse quicken with the familiar excitement that accompanied the beginning of a truly challenging investigation. "What sort of objective?" "We're not certain, but the evidence suggests it involves the highest levels of government. Several of the captured agents have made references to a final accounting that would settle old scores and complete their original mission. We think they're planning an attack on senior political or military figures, possibly timed to coincide with some significant anniversary or public event." The implications were terrifying. A network of highly trained enemy agents operating with decades of preparation and intimate knowledge of British security procedures could potentially assassinate key government officials or compromise national security on a scale that defied imagination. "How can I help?" Miss Marple asked. "By doing what you do best," Craddock replied. "We need you to study the evidence we've gathered, look for patterns that our analysts might have missed, and help us understand what these people are really planning. Your insights into human behavior could be the key to preventing a catastrophe." Miss Marple agreed without hesitation, understanding that the skills she had developed in solving village mysteries might prove crucial in preventing a national tragedy. Eleanor Whitmore's sacrifice had exposed the conspiracy, but the battle against the Stitch Society and its affiliated networks was far from over. Over the following weeks, Miss Marple found herself immersed in a world of classified documents, intelligence reports, and surveillance photographs that revealed the extraordinary sophistication of the enemy network. The more she learned about their operations, the more impressed she became with Eleanor's courage in attempting to expose them single-handedly. The Stitch Society's members had been recruited through a combination of blackmail, bribery, and ideological Conversion that exploited the disillusionment some former operatives felt about their country's post-war policies. They had been patient, methodical, and utterly ruthless in pursuing their objectives, eliminating dozens of innocent people who had posed even minimal threats to their security. But it was the personal details that Miss Marple found most disturbing. Mrs. Thornbury, whom she had known for over 20 years, had been systematically gathering intelligence about local government officials, military installations, and industrial facilities. Mrs. Webb had been using her reputation as a village gossip to collect information about the personal lives and vulnerabilities of prominent citizens who might be targeted for recruitment or elimination. The betrayal cut deeper than professional disappointment. It represented a fundamental violation of the trust that held communities together. These women had shared tea and gossip and knitting patterns while secretly planning activities that could have resulted in the deaths of their neighbors and friends. Miss Marple's analysis of the enemy network's activities revealed patterns that had escaped the attention of professional intelligence analysts. The locations of their rural bases formed a strategic network that provided coverage of key military installations, government facilities, and transportation hubs. Their elimination of elderly witnesses followed a systematic pattern that suggested they were protecting specific types of information rather than simply maintaining general security. Most significantly, the timing of their recent activities suggested that they were preparing for some sort of major operation. The acceleration of witness eliminations, the activation of escape protocols, and the references to a final accounting all pointed toward an imminent climax to decades of careful preparation. Miss Marple presented her findings to Inspector Craddock and a small group of senior intelligence officials in a secure conference room at Scotland Yard. The atmosphere was tense with the knowledge that they were racing against time to prevent a catastrophe whose exact nature remained frustratingly unclear. The pattern suggests that they're planning multiple simultaneous operations, Miss Marple explained, indicating a map that showed the locations of known Stitch Society cells. The geographical distribution isn't random. Each cell is positioned to strike at specific targets that would maximize the impact of their attack. Colonel Whitfield, a senior intelligence officer who had been assigned to coordinate the government's response to the crisis, studied the map with growing concern. What sort of targets are you thinking of? Key government officials, certainly, but also infrastructure targets that would paralyze the country's response to a coordinated attack. Transportation hubs, communication centers, power stations, anything. That would create maximum chaos and confusion. The room fell silent as the officials contemplated the implications of Miss Marple's analysis. A coordinated attack by highly trained enemy agents could potentially cripple the government's ability to respond to a crisis, creating the kind of chaos that might allow hostile foreign powers to achieve objectives that would normally be impossible. Do we have any indication of when this attack might occur? Colonel Whitfield asked. Miss Marple had been studying this question intensively, looking for clues in the captured documents and surveillance reports that might reveal the enemy's timetable. The evidence suggests that they're waiting for a specific date or event that has symbolic significance. Given their background as wartime operatives, I suspect they're planning their attack to coincide with some anniversary related to the war or its aftermath. Inspector Craddock consulted a calendar that he had been using to track the timeline of recent events. Armistice Day is approaching, November 11th. That would certainly have symbolic significance for former wartime operatives. Miss Marple nodded, thoughtfully. It would also be a time when senior government officials would be gathered in public locations for ceremonial events, making them vulnerable to the kind of coordinated attack that the Stitch Society appears to be planning. The implications were chilling. Armistice Day ceremonies traditionally brought together the highest levels of government and military leadership in predictable locations and at predictable times. A well-coordinated attack could potentially eliminate much of the country's senior leadership in a single operation. Colonel Whitfield rose from his chair with obvious urgency. "We need to begin implementing emergency security protocols immediately. If Miss Marple is correct about their timing, we have less than 2 weeks to identify and neutralize the remaining cells before they can launch their attack." The race against time that followed tested every skill that Miss Marple had developed during her years of solving mysteries. Working with teams of professional intelligence analysts, she studied surveillance reports, decoded communications intercepts, and analyzed behavioral patterns that might reveal the locations and intentions of the enemy agents who remained at large. The work was painstaking and often frustrating, requiring the kind of patient attention to detail that Miss Marple had learned from years of knitting and needlework. Each thread of evidence had to be carefully examined and connected to others until patterns emerged that revealed the larger design of the enemy's plan. Gradually, the scope of the conspiracy became clear. The Stitch Society had been planning their attack for over 5 years, carefully positioning assets and gathering intelligence, while eliminating anyone who might have detected their preparations. Their plan involved simultaneous strikes at government buildings, transportation networks, and communication systems that would create enough chaos to allow foreign military forces to land unopposed. The attack was scheduled for Armistice Day, when ceremonial events would bring together senior officials from across the government and military in locations that had been thoroughly scouted by enemy agents. The symbolism was deliberate. The day that commemorated Britain's victory in one war would mark the beginning of her defeat in another. Miss Marple's analysis identified 17 separate targets that would be struck simultaneously, each one selected to maximize both physical damage and psychological impact. The coordination required for such an operation was staggering, but the enemy had decades to prepare and the resources of a major foreign power behind them. As November 11th approached, security forces worked frantically to locate and neutralize the remaining enemy cells. Several were captured in dramatic raids that revealed caches of weapons and explosives sufficient to level city blocks. But others remained elusive, protected by their deep cover identities and their intimate knowledge of British security procedures. Miss Marple found herself working 18-hour days in the secure facilities at Scotland Yard, analyzing intelligence, reports, and trying to anticipate the enemy's next move. The weight of responsibility was enormous. The success or failure of the counterintelligence operation might depend on her ability to think like the enemy agents and understand their psychology. 3. Days before Armistice Day, Miss Marple made a discovery that changed everything. Hidden in the coded communications that had been intercepted from enemy agents was a reference to a 13th hour that would bring final victory to the true believers. The phrase meant nothing to the professional cryptographers, but Miss Marple recognized it as a reference to a specific location that had symbolic significance in the history of the Stitch Society. The 13th hour was a code name for Westminster Abbey, where a special Armistice Day service would be attended by the royal family, senior government ministers, and military leaders from across the Commonwealth. An attack on such a gathering would not only eliminate much of the country's leadership, but would also strike at the very heart of British national identity. Miss Marple's revelation triggered the most intensive security operation in British history. Westminster Abbey was surrounded by armed police and military units, while plainclothes agents infiltrated the crowd of spectators who would gather for the ceremony. Electronic surveillance equipment monitored every communication channel, and snipers were positioned on rooftops throughout central London. But the Stitch Society had been planning their operation for years, and they had anticipated the security measures that would be taken to protect their primary target. As Miss Marple studied their methods and psychology, she began to suspect that the attack on Westminster Abbey was itself a diversion, a high-profile operation designed to draw attention away from their real objective. The breakthrough came when Miss Marple realized that the enemy's true target was not the ceremonial gathering at Westminster Abbey, but the secure bunker beneath Whitehall, where the government's crisis management team would coordinate the response to the apparent attack. By striking at the Abbey first, the enemy would force the surviving officials to gather in what they believed was the most secure location in London, where a second wave of attackers would be waiting for them. Miss Marple's warning reached the crisis management team just hours before the planned attack. Emergency protocols were activated that dispersed government officials to multiple secure locations, while the bunker beneath Whitehall was evacuated and sealed. The enemy's carefully planned operation was disrupted at the crucial moment, forcing them to abandon their mission or face certain capture. The Armistice Day ceremony proceeded under unprecedented security, with the knowledge that enemy agents might be attempting to strike at any moment. But Miss Marple's analysis had been correct. The attack never came, because the enemy had realized that their plan had been discovered and their primary objective was no longer achievable. In the days that followed, the remaining members of the Stitch Society and their affiliated networks were systematically hunted down and captured. Some fled the country, others went into deep hiding, but their organization was shattered beyond repair. The decades-long espionage operation that had threatened the very foundations of British security was finally brought to an end. Miss Marple returned to St. Mary Mead with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had served her country in its hour of greatest need. The official recognition of her contribution was necessarily limited. The true nature of the threat could not be revealed without compromising other ongoing security operations. But she carried with her the knowledge that Eleanor Whitmore's sacrifice had ultimately prevented a national catastrophe. The village of St. Mary Mead seemed smaller and more peaceful after the intensity of the intelligence work. But Miss Marple found herself viewing her neighbors with new appreciation for the innocent pleasures of genuine community life. The Tuesday evening knitting circle would never resume. Too many of its members had been revealed as enemy agents, but other social activities continued as they always had, binding the community together with threads of friendship and mutual support. Miss Marple took up her own knitting with renewed pleasure, finding comfort in the simple, honest work of creating something useful and beautiful with her own hands. Each stitch was a small act of faith in the future, a quiet assertion that life would continue despite the threats that lurked in the shadows. But she never forgot Eleanor Whitmore or the courage that had made victory possible. The empty chair in the parish hall stood as a permanent reminder of the price that freedom sometimes demanded, and the broken knitting needles that had first revealed the mystery were preserved as a testament to the power of ordinary people to stand against extraordinary evil. As winter settled over St. Mary Mead and the village prepared for Christmas, Miss Marple often found herself thinking about the nature of heroism and the forms it could take. Eleanor Whitmore had not worn a uniform or carried a weapon, but she had fought in one of the most important battles of the post-war era. Her weapons had been knitting needles and green wool, her battlefield a comfortable parish hall, but her victory had been as significant as any won on more traditional fields of conflict. The mystery of the knitting club was solved, its perpetrators brought to justice, and its victims honored with the recognition they deserved. But the deeper mystery, the question of how ordinary people found the courage to face extraordinary challenges, remained as compelling as ever. Eleanor Whitmore had provided one answer to that question, an answer that would inspire others when they faced their own moments of testing. In her quiet cottage on the edge of the village, Miss Marple continued her knitting as winter deepened and the year drew to its close. Each evening, she would sit by her fire working on some new project, her needles clicking with the same rhythm that had marked Eleanor's final hours. The sound was comforting and familiar, a link to generations of women who had found solace and purpose in the ancient craft of turning wool into useful and beautiful things. Sometimes when the wind was particularly strong, Miss Marple would pause in her work and listen to the sounds of the night. She would think about Eleanor, alone in her cottage during those final weeks, knitting her coded messages while enemy agents closed in around her. The courage it must have taken to continue that work, knowing that discovery meant certain death, was almost beyond imagination. But Eleanor had continued stitch by stitch, row by row, until her message was complete and her warning preserved for those who would come after her. She had given everything she had to protect her country and her neighbors, asking nothing in return except the hope that her sacrifice would not be forgotten. Miss Marple ensured that it would not be. In the quiet way that was her specialty, she made certain that Eleanor's story was remembered and honored by those who had the wisdom to understand its significance. The official records would classify much of what had happened, but the essential truth would survive, that a gentle village woman had faced down an army of enemy agents and won. The green cardigan that Eleanor had been knitting was eventually completed by Miss Marple herself, using the same pattern and the same careful attention to detail that Eleanor had brought to her work. When it was finished, Miss Marple donated it to the church jumble sale, where it was purchased by a young mother who appreciated its fine workmanship without ever knowing the extraordinary story of its creation. It seemed fitting that Eleanor's final project should continue to serve others, providing warmth and comfort in the same selfless spirit that had characterized her life. The cardigan would outlast the memory of the crisis that had created it, becoming simply another example of the anonymous kindness that held communities together in times of trouble and peace alike. As Christmas approached and the village prepared for its annual celebrations, Miss Marple found herself grateful for the ordinary pleasures that made life worth living. The carol services and Christmas fairs, the visits from family and friends, the simple joy of giving gifts created with her own hands, all of these things took on deeper meaning because of what she had learned about how quickly they could be lost. Eleanor Whitmore had died to preserve this world of innocent pleasures and genuine human connections. The enemy agents who had infiltrated St. Mary Mead had sought to destroy not just the government and military infrastructure of the nation, but the very spirit that made it worth defending. Their failure was a victory not just for national security, but for all the values that Eleanor had embodied in her quiet, unremarkable life. The Christmas morning service at St. Mary's Church was particularly meaningful that year, with prayers offered for those who had given their lives in service of others. Miss Marple sat in her usual pew, her hands folded over the small prayer book that had belonged to her grandmother, and thought about the different forms that service could take. Eleanor's service had been hidden and dangerous, requiring skills and courage that few people possessed. But there were other forms of service that were equally important, the daily acts of kindness and generosity that held communities together, the willingness to help neighbors in times of need, the simple decision to choose hope over despair when faced with life's inevitable challenges. Miss Marple had learned to see heroism in both its dramatic and ordinary forms, understanding that the same spirit that enabled Eleanor to face down enemy agents also inspired the village women who volunteered at the hospital, the men who served on the parish council, and the children who helped elderly neighbors with their shopping. The mystery of the knitting club had revealed depths of evil that few people could have imagined, but it had also revealed depths of goodness that were equally extraordinary. Eleanor's courage had inspired others, Dorothy Pembridge, Dr. Haydock, Inspector Craddock, and countless others who had played their parts in bringing the conspiracy to light. As the service concluded, and the congregation dispersed into the crisp winter morning, Miss Marple walked slowly through the churchyard, where so many of the village's former residents lay at rest. Some had lived lives of quiet obscurity. Others had achieved recognition for their contributions to the community or the nation. But all had played their parts in the great human drama of love and loss, courage and failure, hope and despair that defined the human condition. Eleanor Whitmore's grave was marked by a simple headstone that gave only her name and dates, with no indication of the extraordinary courage she had shown in her final weeks. But Miss Marple knew that the most important monuments were not carved in stone, but carried in the hearts and memories of those who understood the true value of a life well lived. The broken knitting needles that had started the entire investigation were eventually returned to Dorothy Pembridge, who kept them as a reminder of her friend's courage and the price of freedom. Sometimes she would take them out and hold them, marveling at how such ordinary objects could have played such an important role in preventing a national catastrophe. Miss Marple's own knitting took on new meaning as well, each project becoming a meditation on the nature of creation and destruction, patience and haste, beauty and utility. She understood now why Eleanor had chosen to encode her final message in knitting. The ancient craft represented everything that the enemy agents had sought to destroy, the patient accumulation of skill and beauty that could only flourish in a society that valued peace over war, creativity over destruction. The village of St. Mary Mead continued its quiet existence, largely unaware of how close it had come to being the epicenter of a national tragedy. The residents went about their daily lives, tending their gardens, running their shops, raising their children and caring for their elderly. The rhythms of rural life continued as they had for centuries, marked by the changing seasons and the cycle of human generations. But Miss Marple carried with her the knowledge of what had been at stake and what had been preserved by Eleanor's courage. The peaceful village life that her neighbors took for granted was precious precisely because it was fragile, dependent on the willingness of people like Eleanor to sacrifice everything when necessary to protect it. As spring returned to St. Mary, Mead and the cycle of life began anew. Miss Marple found herself thinking often about the lessons she had learned from the mystery of the knitting club. The most important truth was perhaps the simplest, that ordinary people were capable of extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it, and that the greatest victories were often won not on battlefields, but in quiet moments of moral choice. Eleanor Whitmore had faced such a moment and chosen correctly, despite knowing what that choice would cost her. Her decision had saved countless lives and preserved the freedom that made civilized life possible. She had left behind no children to carry on her name, no great achievements to be remembered by history, nothing but the knowledge that when her moment came, she had not been found wanting. Miss Marple understood that this was the most important kind of legacy, not fame or fortune, but the quiet satisfaction of having done the right thing when it mattered most. Eleanor's story would never be told in its entirety, the classified nature of the case ensuring that much of what had happened would remain hidden, but the essential truth would survive, passed on through the quiet networks of understanding that connected those who recognized courage when they saw it. The teapot had long since grown cold on that October evening when Dorothy Pembridge first discovered Eleanor's empty chair and broken knitting needles, but the mystery they had revealed continued to resonate in the lives of those who had been touched by it, a reminder that evil could be defeated by ordinary people who refused to accept defeat. Miss Marple returned to her own knitting with deeper appreciation for the craft and its traditions, understanding now that every stitch was an act of faith in the future. Eleanor Whitmore had knitted her way into immortality, creating a legacy of courage that would inspire others long after her name was forgotten by all but those who had known her best. The empty chair in the parish hall would eventually be filled by another member of the reconstituted knitting circle, but Eleanor's place in the hearts of those who understood her sacrifice would remain forever occupied. She had taught them that heroes could emerge from the most unlikely places, that the greatest battles were often fought in silence and secrecy, and that victory sometimes came at a price that only the bravest were willing to pay. In the end, the mystery of the Knitting Club was not really about espionage or conspiracy or international intrigue. It was about the eternal struggle between good and evil, played out in the most ordinary of settings by the most unlikely of heroes. Eleanor Whitmore had shown that the outcome of that struggle depended not on grand gestures or public acclaim, but on the quiet courage of individuals who chose to do what was right, regardless of the consequences. Miss Marple would carry that lesson with her for the rest of her days, finding in it both inspiration and comfort during the inevitable challenges that lay ahead. Eleanor's legacy lived on not in monuments or memorials, but in the continuing faith that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they found the courage to try. The broken knitting needles had told their story, revealing truths that had been hidden for decades and ensuring that justice was finally done. But their most important message was simpler and more universal, that the tools of creation could become weapons against destruction, that patience could triumph over violence, and that love of country and community could inspire sacrifices that echoed through eternity. As Miss Marple worked on her evening knitting in the months and years that followed, she would often think of Eleanor and smile at the memory of her friend's quiet courage. Each stitch became a prayer, each row a meditation on the nature of sacrifice and service. The ancient craft that had provided the key to solving the mystery continued to provide comfort and meaning, connecting her to generations of women who had found in their needlework both solace and strength. The mystery of the Knitting Club was solved, its lessons learned and its heroes honored in the ways that mattered most. Eleanor Whitmore had knitted her way into history, creating a pattern of courage that would inspire others to follow her example when their own moments of testing arrived. In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, her memory lived on in the click of knitting needles and the eternal hope that good would ultimately triumph over evil, one stitch at a time.